e4. King's pawn opening, opening line. The king's pawn opening move is both popular and logical. It controls the center, opens lines for both the queen and the bishop, and usually leads to an open game in which tactics, rather than slow maneuvering, predominates. c5. Sicilian defense, opening line. The Sicilian defense has an ancient lineage. It creates an unbalanced position in which both sides have full rein for play, and allows black to call the shots at least to some extent. Knight f3. Sicilian defense, king's knight variation, opening line. White's normal response prepares d4 and avoids such committing moves as f4 or d3 or knight c3, which have their own rationale. d6. Sicilian defense, Kopek variation, opening line. d4. Sicilian defense, Kopek variation, opening line. c takes d4. Sicilian defense, Tartakower variation, opening line. Knight takes d4. Sicilian defense, normal variation, opening line. Knight f6. Sicilian defense, Benko variation, opening line. The knight attack on the e4 pawn forces white to commit to its protection. Knight c3. Sicilian defense, opening line. Knight c6. Sicilian defense, opening line. Bishop g5. Sicilian defense, Richter-Rauser, opening line. e6. Sicilian defense, Richter-Rauser, opening line. Queen d2. Sicilian defense, Richter-Rauser, Rauser attack, opening line. a6. Sicilian defense, Richter-Rauser, Rauser attack, opening line. Castle queenside. Sicilian defense, Richter-Rauser, Rauser attack, opening line. Bishop d7. Sicilian defense, Richter-Rauser, Rauser attack, opening line. f3. Out of opening book. f4 would have been in the Sicilian defense, Richter-Rauser, Rauser attack, opening line. Knight takes d4. Queen takes d4. White wins a knight for a knight. Material is even. Bishop e7. Frees the pin on black's knight and makes way for a castle to the king's side. h4. Queen c7. Makes way for a castle to the queen's side. King b1. b5. g4. Castle kingside. Queen d2. b4. Attacks white's knight. Knight e2. Moves it to safety and attacks black's pawn at b4. Rook f c8. Knight g3. a5. Protects black's pawn at b4. Knight h5. a4. Bishop takes f6. Threatens black's bishop at e7 and blocks black's pawn at f7. Bishop takes f6. Knight takes f6 check. Checks black's king and blocks black's pawn at f7. G takes f6. Removes the threat on black's king. Black wins a bishop and a knight. for a bishop and a knight. Material is even. Bishop d3, a3, e5, threatens black's pawn at f6. King f8. Slightly better is f takes e5. Cogitating. The chessmaster recommends pawn at f6 takes pawn. Your pawn at f6 takes pawn. White responds by moving the queen to h6, which blocks your pawn at h7. You move your bishop to a4, which pins white's pawn at c2. White answers with bishop takes pawn, which checks your king and creates a passed pawn on h4. You are forced to move your king to h8, which moves it out of check. White responds with rook captures pawn, which frees white's pawn at c2 from the pin. Your pawn takes pawn, which creates a passed pawn on b2 and isolates white's pawn at a2 and white's pawn at c2. White counters with bishop to e4, which protects white's rook at d6, forks your king and your rook at a8, and blocks your pawn at e5. You are forced to move your king to g8, which moves it out of check and attacks white's rook at d6. White counters by moving the rook to h2. You move your pawn to b3. White responds with the queen to h7, which removes the threat on white's rook at d6 and checks your king. You are forced to move your king to f8, which moves it out of check and threatens white's rook at d6. White counters with pawn at a2, captures pawn, which threatens your bishop and creates passed pawns on b3 and c2. Your queen captures rook. White answers with bishop takes rook. As a result of this line of play, white's attack potential is decreased. Additionally, your pawn structure is somewhat stronger, and the development of white's pawns is somewhat weakened. King f8. Slightly better is f takes e5. E takes f6. White wins a pawn. White is up a pawn. King e8. b3. Queen b6. Removes the threat on black's pawn at b4. Bishop takes h7. Creates a passed pawn on h4. White wins a pawn. White is up 2 pawns in material. d5. h5. Pushes the passed pawn. Bishop c6. Bishop g8. King d7. Attacks white's bishop. Bishop takes f7. Creates passed pawns on f6 and g4. White wins a pawn. White is ahead by 3 pawns. Rook f8. Attacks white's bishop. Bishop g6. Moves it to safety. Rook takes f6. attacks White's pawn at f3. Black wins a pawn. White is up 2 pawns. f4. Moves it out of harm's way. Rook a f8. f5. e5. Slightly better is e takes f5. Analyzing. The chessmaster recommends pawn captures pawn. Your pawn takes pawn, which attacks White's pawn at g4. White responds with bishop captures pawn, which removes the threat on White's pawn at g4, checks your king, and creates a passed pawn on g4. You move your king to c7, which moves it out of check. White answers with pawn to h6, which advances the passed pawn. You move your pawn to d4, which threatens White's rook at h1. White responds with rook to h4, which moves it to safety. You move your rook to d6. White answers with pawn to h7, which adds a promote threat at h7. You move your rook to h8, which blocks White's pawn at h7 and removes the promote threat at h7. White responds by moving the rook to e1, which takes control of the open file. You move your bishop to b7. White responds by moving rook to e7, which checks your king. You move your king to b8, which moves it out of check. As a result of this sequence of moves, you win a pawn for a pawn. Additionally, the mobility of your pieces is enhanced. e5. Slightly better is e takes f5. g5. Attacks Black's rook at f6 and advances the passed pawn. Rook takes f5 leads to bishop takes f5 check. Rook takes f5 h6 d4 h7. Bishop takes h1 h8 queen. Bishop d5 queen d3. Bishop e6 g6 queen c6. Rook f1. Better is rook d6 leading to rook h e1 d4. Rook takes e5 bishop f3. Rook f1 bishop d5 queen e2. Rook g8 f6 bishop e6 queen g2, which gains a queen and a rook and loses a rook, a bishop, and 3 pawns by comparison. This was Black's only significant error of the game, but it was costly. Bishop takes f5 check, checks Black's king. Rook takes f5, protects Black's king. White wins a rook for a bishop and a pawn. h6 advances the passed pawn. d4 attacks White's rook at h1. h7 adds a promote threat at h7. Bishop takes h1. h8 queen. White loses a rook. Additionally, White gains a queen through promotion. Bishop e4 moves it to safety and pins White's pawn at c2. Queen e2. Slightly better is queen h7 check. Cogitating. The chess master recommends queen to h7. You move your queen to h7, which skewers black's rook and checks black's king. Black responds by moving the king to c8, which moves it out of check. You move your rook to e1, which threatens black's bishop. Black responds with the queen to b7, which protects black's bishop and attacks your queen at h7. You move your pawn to g6, which removes the threat on your queen at h7 and pushes the passed pawn. Black answers with queen takes queen, which threatens your pawn at g6. Your pawn captures queen, which adds a promote threat at h7. Black responds by moving rook to h5, which threatens your pawn at h7 with a double attack and moves it behind the passed pawn at h7. Your rook takes bishop, which frees your pawn at c2 from the pin and blocks black's pawn at e5. Black counters with rook takes pawn, which removes the promote threat at h7. You move your rook to e1. Black replies by moving rook to c7. Your queen takes pawn at b4, which threatens black's pawn at a3, creates a passed pawn on b3, and isolates black's pawn at a3. As a result of this line of play, you win a queen, a bishop, and a pawn for a queen and a pawn. Additionally, black's attack potential is greatly decreased. Also, black's pawn formation is somewhat disrupted. Queen e2. Slightly better is queen h7, check. Queen c6. Protects black's bishop. Queen c4. Slightly better is g6. Thinking. The chess master recommends pawn to g6. You move your pawn to g6, which advances the passed pawn. Black responds by moving the queen to c3, which threatens to mate, queen to b2, and blocks your pawn at c2. You move your queen to b5, which checks black's king. Black answers with bishop to c6, which threatens checkmate. Queen to b2 removes the threat on black's king and threatens your queen at b5. You move your queen to h7, which protects your queen at b5 and checks black's king. Black responds by moving the king to e6, which moves it out of check, threatens checkmate. Queen to b2 frees black's pawn at e5 from the pin and threatens your queen at b5. You move your queen to c4, which moves it out of immediate jeopardy and checks black's king. Black counters with queen takes queen, which removes the threat on black's king. You move your pawn to g7, which adds a promote threat at g7. Black counters with queen takes pawn at c2, which forks your rook and your king and creates a passed pawn on d4. Your king captures queen, which protects your rook. Black counters with bishop to e4, which checks your king. You move your king to c1, which moves it out of check. Black responds with rook to g5, which attacks your queen and places it behind the passed pawn at g7. Your queen takes bishop, which blocks black's pawn at e5. Black responds with rook captures pawn, which removes the promote threat at g7. Your rook takes pawn, which pins black's pawn at e5, attacks black's pawn at b4, and isolates black's pawn at e5. As a result of this line of play, you win a queen, a bishop, and a pawn for a queen and 2 pawns. Additionally, the mobility of your pieces is somewhat increased, and black's mobility is greatly decreased. Also, black's pawn structure is weakened. Finally, the pressure on black's king is somewhat increased, and the pressure on your king is eliminated. Queen c4. Slightly better is g6. Queen takes c4. Removes the threat on black's pawn at b4. B takes c4. Creates a passed pawn on c4. Rook f2 hangs the pawn at e5. Leads to rook takes d4, check. E takes d4, queen takes d4, check. King e8, queen takes f2, bishop g6, c5, bishop f7, c6, bishop e6, queen f4, bishop c8, queen e5, check. King d8, queen b8, b3, c takes b3, which wins a rook for a rook and 3 pawns. Better is b3, leading to a takes b3, rook takes g5, rook f1, bishop f5, queen f8, king e6, queen d8, a2, check. King takes a2, rook g7, which wins a pawn for 2 pawns. Queen takes e5. Leads to bishop takes c2, check. King c1, bishop takes d1, queen takes d4, check. King e8, queen takes f2, bishop h5, queen e1, check. King f7, queen takes b4, bishop e2, king d2, bishop f1, queen c5, king g6, which wins a rook and 3 pawns for a rook and a pawn. Better is rook takes d4, check, leading to e takes d4, queen takes d4, check. King e8, queen takes f2, bishop g6, c5, bishop f7, c6, bishop e6, queen f4, bishop c8, queen e5, check. King d8, queen b8, b3, c takes b3, which wins a rook and 3 pawns for a rook. Bishop takes c2, check. Protects black's pawn at d4, forks white's rook and white's king, and creates a passed pawn on d4. Black wins a queen and a pawn for a queen and a pawn. King c1. Moves it out of check and threatens black's pawn at d4 with a double attack. Black resigns.